The gospel reading today is from the book of Luke. It picks up Jesus as he's giving the sermon on the plain and beginning to speak to the crowds that have followed him there. Luke 6:27-38. But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who asks of you. And if anyone takes away what is yours, do not ask for it back again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive payment, what credit is that to you? Sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. This is the word of the Lord.
We are taking another look at what are called the Beatitudes. These are foundational teachings and a guide for Christians. We also have to admit that they are often go against our nature as human beings. It does not feel natural to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek. We do not want to reward people who steal from us, let alone give them more. We want to love those who love us, and quite frankly, we love judging. What do you think awards, ribbons, and trophies are for? Yet it is also in our nature to have a conscience. Deep down, we have a moral compass, and luckily, thus as Christians are able to develop it and have it properly facing the true north. It is interesting in the Western world that as it becomes more secular, less Christian, that we see the efforts of those who live in a more secular life to fill the God-shaped hole that is in our society. It is hard for us not to laugh at immoral people trying to shame people and Christians in general for sins that they did not commit. Oddly enough, it would be much easier to shame us as Christians for failing to teach and lived up to our own ethical values as outlined in the gospel. Our first command today is to love our enemies. We don't want to do that. There is also a lot of money in not loving our enemies. Outrage sells. It gets more clicks. Advertisement and media especially is kind of built on that. Likewise, the defense industry is a major driver of the economy. There are whole towns that work on build parts for weapons of war, and it puts food on the table. It'd be hard to give all that up. In addition, when we think of our faith, when we think of those who detract against it, when we say there are people who cannot quite live up to what you Christians are saying, they're always quick to point out the one or a few times that Christians fall short. It is one of those things that also gives us as Christians existential crises. I remember my ethics professor, Dr. Katie Cannon, who was the first African-American woman ordained in the Presbyterian church. And she once shared kind of her seminary breakdown story. There's a point in seminary and probably a point in any life of discipleship where you kind of break down. And it was interesting because Dr. Cannon was confessing to her students, all 60 of us in her class, because she was one of the more popular teachers on campus. And she was saying that her kind of breakdown was over the Crusades. Yes, her existential crisis was over the Crusades. Kind of people, in medieval times going off and kind of fighting for what they thought were Christ, but really kind of just wrecking the whole world and anything they came into. In fact, she was explaining to her mentor and confessing to her class, how could she be a Christian when the Crusaders had burned, pillaged, and murdered their way to the Holy Land? And she shared with us her mentor's advice, saying, well, you don't have to be that type of Christian. She also pointed out that folks who did that or have been dead for nearly 1,000 years, and there is a reason we are continually not going on crusades. We have seen our mistake and checked it. In fact, the last piece of advice her mentor gave was, in fact, you don't have to act like those crusaders, but you can turn the other cheek. Jesus, in his context, when he is telling us to turn the other cheek, he is living in a Roman world that is very violent. In fact, the head of a Roman family could put to death a slave. They could even put to death a family member, a dependent family member. So it was also one of those things where children, you want to obey your parents in the Roman world. We could also see in that world that nobody could show weakness. The moment one showed weakness, it was an invitation to take advantage. In fact, if you showed weakness, you could start or encourage a feud. And it was one of these feuds that would make the Hatfields and the McCoys look pretty tame. There were whole Roman families that would work against each other for generations and generations. The Roman state also had a monopoly on violence. It was the Roman state who was allowed to execute. It was the Roman state who had the ultimate law. There was no such thing of any law but Roman law. And since they had a monopoly on violence, we also discovered that even some Christians could take or kind of advantage of that. The Apostle Paul used this to his advantage because you would think somebody who is learned in Greek philosophy, somebody that was a Hebrew, he didn't look like a Roman citizen, but in fact he was. And so every time he got himself in trouble, it always seemed to be in the midst of a mob, whether it was at the synagogue, whether it was at where the Greek gods worshiped, whether it was kind of with these Roman citizen merchants who would kind of stir up a mob because Paul was bad for business. It was constantly Paul pulling out his citizenship card and reminding people you cannot hurt Roman citizens. And his way of turning the other cheek is even though he was abused, beaten, sometimes even whipped, when he pulled out kind of that citizenship card, he would always turn the other cheek because anybody who was a non-citizen who hurt a citizen, that could be an executable offense. So Paul constantly turned the other cheek. Now, Christian movements that have embraced turning the other cheek and nonviolence have usually been the most successful. Even in the Roman Empire that put Jesus of Nazareth to death on the cross was brought low not by the vengeance of his disciples, but rather by the love shown by Christians. Christians who loved their enemy. In fact, they always got in trouble for loving other people, like widows and orphans, the poor and the hungry. In fact, after times of persecution where the Roman state would go after Christians simply for being Christian, we would notice that there would be an uptick in the amount of Christians baptized and people returning to church. In fact, the church would grow in the time after persecution because Christians' love was typically on display, and it included those who were persecuted. And eventually, Christianity would become the state religion of the empire that once put Jesus to death. Now, this is held true throughout the years, that nonviolence and turning the other cheek has been an effective Christian strategy. The high point of kind of American Christian church membership was during the second half of the 20th century. It was also a time where the nonviolent action was embraced. In the American South, the civil rights movement was led by Southern Christians who embraced and taught and practiced and had workshops on nonviolent protest. And in about 10 years, in amidst great backlash that could often become violent, this witness won the freedom to eat, to vote, and to gather with Christians of all races in public spaces. Their example also reverberated across the world. In South Africa, we could see that the nonviolent strategy brought down segregation and an apartheid regime. And the one thing we wish that they still held true today. Unfortunately, this century has not really embraced Christian nonviolence or turning the other cheek. It's interesting now that we have kind of more adjectives in front of protests that we see. It'll be fiery or mostly peaceful protest. When a century earlier, the direct action was typically and almost universally described as nonviolent. It is also, unfortunately, that we see that this ideology is not embraced by the right or the left as well. It's been embarrassing for some of us sitting at our computer, scouring through social media, and we'll notice a kid from Sunday school in Ohio is throwing a bottle in the midst of a mob. Likewise, we are acquainted with people who worked at our local food pantry, supported and staffed by Christians, was part of a riot at our nation's capital. It's kind of interesting to see how this is not being practiced today. But there are some who still practice radical forgiveness, and there's a good example from this century. In the aughts, in about 2006 in the fall, following a shooting at a one-room schoolhouse and a suicide that followed in Amish country, we saw the lengths to which faithful Christians can forgive. The mother of the perpetrator of that crime was surprised when 40 members of the Amish community, her neighbors, and like literally the next farm over, her neighbors, were present at the graveyard when she laid her son to rest. That community supported a grieving mother and father, set up a fund to support the man's wife and children, one who had committed an unspeakable crime against their community. I remember this became a topic of our weekly chapel lunch at Muskingum College. And Stephanie, who was from kind of that area in Pennsylvania, who actually had roots in the Amish community, shared that there was one thing she knew about her cousins in that area, is that they fully were devoted to the teachings of Christ. And they weren't going to just ignore that part about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. What struck me this week studying this text was the portion about possessions. If anyone takes your garment or your coat, do not withhold your shirt. Anyone who takes from you, do not ask it about. Ask it back. And it takes a few years to kind of have this advice sit in. I remember kind of being younger and kind of was amazed that friends of mine who had been friends for years could be so upset or kind of even destroy friendships over a little bill or a little debt. It is also hard to believe that they could give years of friendship through elementary school, middle school, and high school for such a simple debt. It's kind of one of those things, as later in the Bible we see that there is also kind of this need. It is better just to give rather than to lend, and sometimes it can save relationships. In fact, it seems like we have better examples of this happening in literature rather than we do real life. If anybody was interested in literature, they might be familiar with the writings of Victor Hugo. In one of his books, there is a character called Jean Valjean, and he was being chased simply for stealing bread. He had been incarcerated for years, And it's one of those things where you have this, when you read the book, you have this sense of injustice, this fanaticism of the law, where this simple person can be, kind of chased down, that there can be even just kind of this one inspector, Javert. He was going through all this effort, hating this one person, and his only crime was stealing his daily bread. Nor do we have to see that's kind of the full measure of human ethical boundaries. We can also see that some people's hearts can change. In fact, we see in Jean Valjean, the hardened convict, a person who could even be a jerk to little kids on the side of the road, when he is caught by police for stealing silverware. We have the next scene where the police bring him to the priest. They bring him to the church where they are quite certain that Jean Valjean stole this silverware and plate. And we see the priest, or kind of later the bishop, saying, "Oh, yes, this is the silver plate, but Jean, you forgot to take the candles on the communion table." And so we see the goodly priest taking the candles off of the communion table, putting them in his bag, talking to Jean Valjean, and wishing him good luck. And he also covered for this convict, telling the police it was a gift. And in this gift, he ransomed the soul of that convict, who later became an outstanding citizen. Someone who later, when dealing with other people who had suffered injustice, helped them as much as he could. Perhaps in literature, we can capture the meaning of Jesus' teaching, as Victor Hugo did. Now, we love to talk about the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto us. And it is usually one of the few things that people know about kind of the teaching of Christ. And as part of this speech to the disciples, we see there is a little bit more. And we can also experience this in our own lives. We are to love people who don't love us. And often we love the very folks who we would typically judge. Now, this can take different forms, and since I've already mentioned the American South, I can mention again, and having lived there for a few years in my life, I can kind of explain or interpret it for some of us who are out west here. And when I talk about the South, I mean Dixie, where people speak in a kind of a different accent that you can almost pinpoint where they are from, Georgia or Mississippi or somewhere else. And one of the things is it takes a while to kind of translate the accent. But also, when you are able to translate it a little bit, it opens up kind of a whole new world and whole new troubles. Because there are ways of speaking in code. Probably the most cliche is if any of you ever hear the phrase, "bless their heart." It's good to some of us. And bless their heart is usually reserved for someone who is pushing on the door that clearly says pull. Just bless their heart. They'll get in there eventually. Likewise, if you just had an odd conversation with a neighbor, or maybe their family member happens to be there too, there is always kind of this phrase where they'll kind of lean over and they'll say, "well, they have a nervous condition." This is code for they're eccentric, unconventional, or sometimes kind of downright crazy. So, just kind of be careful what they say. Another Southern code is, "well, they're Christian," which actually has kind of two different ways it can be spoken. The first group, sometimes you will hear it in, are kind of college kids who think they're the next Truman Capote or Harper Lee. And you find them maybe at the art opening, and if they are talking with their friend, they said, "well, she's Christian." This was code for maybe they're a bit dorky, maybe they're a bit naive, but they are one of us, so we have to treat them well. Likewise, as you can go to the other side of the tracks, usually kind of in the other part of town, and these are people who might be a dream of going to Nashville, but can only go to Branson, Missouri. And they might say, "I helped that person out because, well, he is Christian." And this is code for someone who maybe got over their skis, got themselves into trouble. Maybe you had to bail them out, like changing a flat tire or politely giving someone a ride to the gas station because it turns out those rental cars work on tires and gas. Now, the only way you can really tell this is by their tone, and so really when you have to see what tone they are using. Are they saying someone is being a Christian because they actually are a Christian, or are they just kind of calling them Christian? It's a much different version. But as we wind down, Jesus is setting the tone for his disciple. He is giving teachings of all seriousness. He is telling them that forgiveness should be a major part of our vocabulary. He is saying that love is not just for Valentine's Day, but a language we use with the whole world, not just with the people we like. We should not be judgmental because that is the language reserved for God, and that God is more fluent in mercy than judgment. So we may have to be in tune with God. And if we are in tune with God, we will love, we will be merciful, we will let people have the things that they need, and we will also not take vengeance, but turn the other cheek. And we are to love others as we are to be loved. In this moment, in this space, let us have a few moments of silence before we express to God where we know his love is and where our love should be focused.